Welcome to the Seattle Hall Pass podcast, which dives deep into the heart of Seattle schools. Today, we're going to talk about the school board meeting that happened on September 13th.
My name is Christie Robertson.
And I'm Jane Tungstamel.
So first, Superintendent Jones welcomed kids back to school.
And this week, we welcomed our kindergartners. And they are the class of, drum roll please, 2036, believe it or not, class of 2036. We're excited to have them in the buildings.
And then there were some interesting things in some of the board director comments. Director Rankin talked about meeting with King County Public Health folks about student safety.
Here is Vice President Rankin.
And about not only their efforts for gun violence prevention, which has been obviously a high priority, but an increasingly pretty drastic high priority is drug abuse and overdose. It's everywhere in our community.
One thing that Liza touched on in her comments was a yearly problem where there's not enough teachers at schools in September. And the school district, they say they do their best with enrollment projections, and that's how they staff the schools. But often what we all know who are there at school sites, we see that the class sizes are very large and there's not enough teachers. So what the district does is they wait until the first day of October and they see how many students, and that's when they make the decision to add more teachers to a school site. And here's what Liza has to say about it.
What is more and more apparent to me every start of the school year, even though this start has been much smoother and more kind of normal than the last few years, the state funding limits us so much as a system in that we're funded on a per pupil basis, and the number of pupils is not who's there the first day, not who's enrolled for the year, but who's there in October. And so if the district guesses too high and deploys and commits to contracting with staff, that then there are fewer students than we thought. We don't fire people. We keep them on contract for the year. We're stuck in this cycle of not wanting to short schools and also not wanting to be in a position where we're overestimating and then increasing our deficit when the revenue is not there because of students.
Director Hampson talked about they've been developing the tribal liaison position for Seattle schools, and I think that I'm understanding this correctly, that they're going to be doing a presentation at WASDA, Washington State School Directors Association, to help other districts who need to do tribal consultation. Director Hampson also talked about a webinar series she had attended regarding chronic absence at an organization called WEAC, the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center.
Here is Director Hampson.
But the increase in absences is really major, and it's a crisis level. I would say that it was a great presentation. There was a great amount of data. Again, it's all available, and I'll be happy to share it with you. But it was very much a alert to me that we as a board need to make sure that we are looking at the ways in which we as policymakers need to support our superintendent to ensure that we are not just letting these kids fall away from our school systems. We're not going to certainly achieve our goals if kids aren't coming to school. And it's going to take collaboration with the whole community to solve those issues.
Then came public testimony, very few testifiers. And then they talked about the superintendent evaluation tool.
So the superintendent evaluation tool turned into a really interesting discussion. At first, there was confusion about what they were talking about because the introduction that they had at last meeting, that document looked completely different from the document that they had for this meeting, which was for action. And so there was a few minutes going back and forth with the directors being confused, like, is this intro? Is this action? What is this?
And as you pointed out, they had only uploaded the document the day before, so we think some of the directors hadn't seen the new document and didn't understand what the confusion was.
Yeah, so they weren't set up for success because they need more time to look at it.
Here's Director Rivera-Smith with a little bit of the flavor of that part of the meeting.
I'm trying to recall, and I know when we talked about this at inspection, there was that beautiful, colorful PDF you'd made for us. And I don't see that here. How does that have to do with this? I'm lost a little.
So then Lisa very constructively opened the spreadsheet.
Here's Director Rivera-Smith.
And if I pulled it back up, so I can look at it again. And I see the strategy, I see the implementation. I guess what I don't see on this final document that we're looking at today is the accountability part of it. Because that was something we all kind of talked about how important that was to us.
And so he was able to point her to the parts on this spreadsheet where that was covered.
And of course, if you're interested, you can find the superintendent evaluation tool itself on our show notes. Superintendent Jones went on to talk about how part of his goal is to connect the goals and guardrails developed by the board all the way down into the school buildings through the SSeason for each school. SSeason stands for Continuous School Improvement Plan, and it is a strategic plan developed for each school by the principal and their building leadership team. If you have not seen the SSeason for your school building, you should definitely take a look at it. They have at times been very performative, so it should be pretty interesting to see them actually getting linked up to the high-level goals.
Here's how Superintendent Jones said it.
And then the other piece that's going to be really important is, again, the CSIP, that my goals, my accountability is all the way through the organization to the CSIP. And so to each school CSIP. So we should see some great alignment, and beyond alignment, even integration. And so as schools make gains, we're accountable to providing the right type of support so that they can sustain those gains. As we see gaps at schools, we need to be responsive to how are we going to provide relevant, meaningful, timely, tangible support.
Yeah, so once they worked through the confusion about what is this document, was it intro or was it action, the conversation shifted to a more constructive way. Vivian Song-Mary said that she would vote yes on the superintendent evaluation tool.
Here's what Director Song-Maritz said.
I think what Director Rivera-Smith was bringing up isn't quite answered for me. I hear Director Hampson's comments about the evaluation tool, and I'm in agreement. But what Director Rivera-Smith was bringing forward was when there is a policy and the district is not in compliance with the policy, what happens there? I don't know that this evaluation tool is the right answer to that. And so I will be voting yes on this item. But I do think that that was a question that is unanswered.
And Chandra Hampson agreed that there should be a process at what happens when a policy isn't followed, or maybe the goal isn't successful. And Chandra gave the example of math.
Here's what Director Hampson said.
The big thing that we're having difficulty around right now is math. And we need to have a conversation about it. It's not going away.
And I can't remember who it was who brought up the org chart, that they don't know people's roles and titles.
Yeah. And that was Leslie who mentioned the org chart.
The accountability office, the accountability officer. We have no idea what that job description is. We have the org chart requests, etc. And you promised us a interactive org chart and job descriptions, and that is hugely exciting to me and builds trust with our community and, most importantly, with our voters who are funding us and our families.
And so then, since this item was supposed to be about the superintendent evaluation tool, that's when Brandon tried to kind of get people to focus. He tried to reel them back in. He was saying, if we're up here confused, I can only imagine what the community is thinking, that they must be confused too.
Here's President Hersey.
And I'm not saying that because it's like I don't love to hear, Director Harris or any of you guys go off on a rant. I think you all are great speakers, right? But I think if the real aim is to provide clarity, we just did a terrible job of that.
So he just tried to refocus them on the superintendent evaluation tool and try to keep questions to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then Lisa brought up that, yes, she is also going to vote yes on this item, but she just wants to know what levers they have if policies aren't followed.
Yep. And so the accountability around following policies, I think belongs squarely in the court of the policy review committee under Director Rankin. And I think she took to heart that they'll need to figure out what to do when a policy doesn't get followed, which will be a lot easier when they don't have so many binders full of policies.
Here's Director Sarju.
There is a ridiculous amount of policies that we have. And as someone who, we have binders. You're too young to remember the binders of women, but this is way more than the binders of women in that election.
And the person she was referring to there as being too young to remember the binders full of women was the new student board director, Lola Vandernoot. She had a lot to contribute and was just a really great addition to the mix, I thought.
Yeah, she was awesome.
Director Sarju turned to Lola and made a point about impact versus intent and calling on her to keep them accountable.
Here's what Director Sarju said.
So your job is to understand why we need to focus on students and how we adults sitting here on this dais, sitting against that wall, it's their responsibility to focus on students. And if we're not doing it, you need to call us on it.
Here's what Director Lola Vandernoot said as people were apologizing to her about how that whole discussion had gone.
There were no raised voices. Everybody was willing to hear one another out. Everybody took their turns. And when people realized that maybe they communicated something other than what they intended, they apologized and moved on. And I think that's completely okay.
We caught a good one, didn't we? She just summed that all up in less than 1 minute.
And I just love Michelle Sarju because she doesn't always say something in every conversation, but whenever she does say something, it's often very profound and reminds everyone of why they're there.
Yeah. And then they voted, right?
Yep.
Here's Ellie Wilson-Jones, Director of Board Relations.
This motion is passed by a vote of 6 yes to 1 no.
And the nay was Leslie Harris. I would have hoped that because they didn't have enough time to look at this spreadsheet that had just been posted the day before, that maybe they could have postponed the vote another 2 weeks. But because they wanted to be collaborative and they wanted to keep moving things forward, they did vote yes.
I wonder what the rush was, but I would have voted yes based on the document itself because I did have time to look at it and I thought it was great.
Yeah, and that's probably why they did that, and probably it was the right thing to do.
They approved another contract with carpenters. Nothing too surprising in that contract. And then they moved on to the introductory items. The first item was the Disciplinary Appeal Council. I remember when Michelle Sarju decided to take this on, it came before the board for approval a couple years ago or a year ago. And it was something that everybody was kind of not satisfied with. It was one of those situations, kind of like the student rights and responsibilities, where everybody's like, oh, this thing, we hate this thing, but we always just kind of pass it because we have to. But Director Sarju was like, no, that's not happening. I'm going to fix this. So she took it on.
And the Discipline Appeal Council, it hears appeals for suspensions, expulsions, and emergency removals from schools. And here's a few words from Michelle Sarju on why she took this on.
Some of us know that the disproportionality in discipline in this district essentially upholds the school-to-prison pipeline. In July, we revised the policy governing the council, and we can now appoint members under our updated policy. An application for council members was posted to our website and shared broadly with families, staff, and community beginning in August. To date, we have 73 applications that were received prior to yesterday's deadline.
The applications are being reviewed by Director Sarju, Director Hampson, and Director Song-Moritz. And here's Michelle Sarju explaining the selection criteria.
So we have the following requirements for our appointments. Number 1, members are appointed to 3-year terms. Number 2, the council is made up of 5 community members not employed by the district, and 4 district staff. Number 3, our appointees will be reflective of the students most impacted by district student disciplinary decisions through race, ethnicity, and experience. Number 4, our appointees must be knowledgeable about state and district student discipline rules, policies, and procedures. We will support them in that by offering an orientation. Additionally, we identified the following priorities for our selection process. We will use a targeted universalism approach. We will ensure we have applicants who are of and from the communities most impacted by student discipline and look for applicants with direct lived experience. We will look for understanding of child development and experience with students we see being disproportionately disciplined, such as students receiving multilingual services or special education services.
One other thing I thought was really interesting was that Michelle Sargi said that all of this is through the lens of targeted universalism. And that's a term that you hear a lot these days. And she recommended an explanation from Othering and Belonging, which I guess is from UC Berkeley. And we'll put that in the show notes.
Great. Okay, next they talked about the criteria for selecting projects for the Building Excellence Levy.
Yeah, and Director Rankin explains that the state does not fund capital projects, so the school district has to have levies. That's the only way that we have new buildings built and also the only way that we can maintain the structures. Here's what she says.
So this is about a levy that will go before voters in February 2025. And we start this process really early with guiding principles so that staff has time to build the levy package and ask to prepare to go on the ballot. So this board action report establishes our direction from the board for the Building Excellence or BEX 6 capital levy.
And Director Rankin, Director Rivera-Smith, and Director Songmeritz all went over these together. And they also brought them to the levy committee.
They have a scoring method, and the principles that they had come up with for introduction were high-quality, inclusive environments, facilities planning, accessibility, safe and secure schools.
They were talking about site safety, security, and emergency response preparedness. And when they brought these foundational principles to the committee that's made up of community members and central staff, they brought up safe routes to schools and sidewalks, because there are a lot of neighborhoods in Seattle where there's no sidewalks.
And here's Vivian Songmeritz with more about this.
Behind the discussion that we have around safe routes is that the school experience does extend beyond the physical experience being in the building. So a suggestion to adapt one of these principles to be more expansive of what that school experience is like, and perhaps we should be making decisions around our capital projects with that in consideration.
And then technology.
And then the last principle was environmental sustainability. They're thinking about clean and renewable energy and also how to reduce the energy usage.
We'll definitely put this on our web notes because usually there's a 2-week gap between introduction and action, but Director Rankin specifically wanted to leave a month because she wants feedback from community as well as the directors. At this point in the meeting, AJ Crable from Great City Schools led the directors through a discussion about effective goal monitoring. So I want to give kudos to the directors because I completely did not follow this conversation about effective goal monitoring after the long meeting, but once I had listened back to it and really delved in, they all were right paying attention and participating. I want to actually put a link to this whole section because I think it's one of the best explanations for the point of student outcomes focused governance that I've seen.
And they covered a lot of interesting topics which come up again and again in all of these conversations. Things like culture versus policy or strategy versus tactics. Here's how AJ Crable talks about culture versus policy.
I think a lot of board members are of the belief that the most powerful thing the board can do is set policy. That is not my observation. My observation is that policy is powerful only when it is paired with culture. And if there is culture that is going left and policy that is going right, my experience tells me your school system is probably going to go left. And so if you really want to drive performance improvements, you have to make in any domain, but particularly in student learning and student growth, that you have to match what you are saying with what you are doing. The policy is the saying part, but I would argue that it is the less powerful of the two, but that it is incredibly powerful when it is paired with the actual doing. And so monitoring is showing here's what we value because we're spending time focusing on it, and we're modeling what we think that ought to look like, not only for us, but that we want people to have open and transparent conversations about performance all throughout the organization.
And I loved hearing what he had to say about that, but I don't necessarily agree with all of it because I think policy is really important. And I think that sounds great in an ideal world, but because Seattle Public Schools, in my opinion, hasn't proven itself capable of doing all these things. And I think that's why some of the directors might be also asking tactical questions and not just strategic questions, because the district hasn't been accountable. They don't follow all the policies. And so the school district still needs strong oversight. So it's a struggle.
And then AJ went through his set of criteria for determining whether a question is effective at setting a culture of accountability to the goals and guardrails.
Here's AJ Crable.
First is that it's ideal for a conversation around monitoring goals to be focused on strategy rather than to be focused on tactics.
He had an interesting point that you want to focus on strategy because you want your superintendent to focus on strategy. And if you focus on tactics, your superintendent will focus on tactics. And then the staff don't get to do their jobs that they're experts on. But I agree with you that there's some times where you want to bring up tactics. Like, for example, I just want to make sure that when you're teaching kids to read, that you are teaching them phonics. Like, can we just all agree that that is an important thing? I know that's tactical, but
yeah, or
maybe that doesn't need to be done in a board meeting, but
right. Or another example is that they have a 7th grade math goal, but then all over the city, they have these 4th, 5th grade splits with 32 students or more in them. And so how is that helping them reach their math goal in 7th grade?
And that is something that I think is not spelled out enough, is how do you make sure it's the things that are happening on the ground thing? How do you take into account what your community is telling you is happening? How do you go out to community, make sure you hear from all of the different voices? And if everybody is saying these classes are really big, my kid isn't learning math because the teacher can't differentiate that much, do you have to wait until you get those numbers back for years that say math isn't progressing? Or do you pay attention to what your community is telling you?
And Vivian, she talked about the struggle between tactical and strategic questions. And here's what she said.
I would say that I think for me, where I kind of struggle to come up with strategic questions is because I'm just going to be honest, up to this point, I still have trouble articulating what the strategies truly mean. Like for our 3rd grade reading goal, it's excellent teaching and joyful learning. And I'm kind of struggling between like strategy versus tactic, but those words are not super clear to me what that means. And so because I'm in that position, it makes it really hard for me to ask the questions.
And the response, I don't think, was very satisfactory because it was focused on helping her understand, but that doesn't help the community understand. But then he moved on to talk about more of his criteria.
Here's AJ Crable.
The second is, are we measure focused? Are we actually looking at the data?
From the way they talked about it, I think of it as measure focused versus access focused. And this is something they've been talking about for a long time, that it's so important, even though in your mind, when you have two friends asking you about something and then you see three people talk about it on Facebook and it feels like this is what the community says. But that's not the whole community. That's your window into the community.
Here's AJ Crable.
Now, it's a subtle thing that happens, and it's easy to miss, but that is what takes place, is that we're not really grounding it in what is the actual measure, what is the actual data that we said is important about what our students don't are able to do. What we're really doing is we're saying that the opinions of the people with access to me as a board member actually are more meaningful and more valid than the reality of what's happening in the lives of our students writ large.
And I hear what he's saying there, but I do also think if you're hearing about things from, say, three people, if they're at different schools and it's happening at those schools and you keep hearing something again and again, usually it is pointing to something that might be going on. And unfortunately, it is the people with privilege who you're going to probably hear from first, but sometimes they might be saying something that's worth listening to.
So that's just something that they haven't worked out. They've mostly responded by not listening to community. And I think that you miss things that way.
And one of the directors who listens to community all the time is Leslie Harris. But then he was praising her.
She has a new title.
Yeah. And here's what he says about her questions.
And so I realize it is uncomfortable, and my condolences to Brent and his team, but I encourage the tough questions. Obviously the queen of tough question on your board tends to be Leslie, and that's one of the reasons that I really appreciate how she shows up.
And then he goes on to talk more about tough questions, and I really love the way he says to center the outcomes for students over the comfort of your staff.
I think that's incredibly appropriate to have really tough and challenging questions, especially if it's something you're authentically struggling with yourself. And I think Brent and his team just have to, I think they just have to roll with it. And it's either going to train them on how to communicate differently and they'll level up in that way, or it's going to train them on how to use language that isn't all academic ease. I think it is healthy for them. It will not be comfortable for them, but I would not have you calibrate effective goal monitoring toward the comfort of your staff. I would calibrate toward the clarity for your community. And that will invariably create, so like somebody's going to have to deal with discomfort. I would have your staff deal with the discomfort. I think that is a more appropriate way to go than having your community live with the discomfort that you were living with of not having clarity. And so if there are strategies that they're describing to you and you're just not getting it, it's like, I don't understand how this strategy connects. Like, can you explain it to me? I think that is an appropriate question to ask during monitoring.
I think we'll leave off the rest of the criteria for time. And let's conclude with this quote from AJ Crable.
It's the community's schools, the community's children, the community's tax dollars, the community's buildings. The community does, in fact, have a right to know. This is part of why we would monitor. And in that case, to make your point, Brent, not merely monitor, but monitor in a way that's observable to the public.
At this point, it was very late, and there were a couple of items still left on the agenda.
Liza was in her preparations for the Washington State School Directors Association.
She brought forward position statements, which include actually adding some language around student outcomes. That I think proposing that be more of a general Washington State thing, which was interesting. And she's bringing a position statement against restraint and isolation of students. The more organizations that we can have that will help us lobby against holding down and locking up students, the better.
And then the other directors had a few questions, and here's one from Leslie Harris.
We've had conversations on this board for a long time about having school board directors compensated. And it's a subject very close to many, many hearts. And I'm wondering, where do we stand on that, both with respect to WASDA and whether WASDA will incorporate that in their legislative agenda. And I get that it's not a lengthy legislative session, but where are we in terms of consistency on that aspect?
Yeah, and the background on this is that the state limits the amount of money that a school board director can be paid. It's $4,800 a year. Well, you probably know more. Christie, tell us, what is a $4,800 supposed to be for?
It's called a per diem, not to exceed $4,800.
So in reality, they're not even paid. And as one of the school board directors has told us, she says she just wants to get paid enough so she can pay for babysitting to come to the meetings, which currently $4,800 does not cover that. And in response, Director Rankin said that school board director compensation was already one of WASDA's existing position statements, so it did not need to be added.
The Washington State PTA has resolutions and positions, and I don't remember which is which, but one of them is, here's how we feel about all these different things. And the other one is, here's what we are going to actively lobby about in the next session. So I wonder if a better question might be, is this one of the things on the slate to be actively lobbied about? Is somebody working on this? And I think that we will leave it there.
If you want to attend a school board meeting, you can find the calendar
On the Seattle Public Schools website. At the top, go to I want to attend a school board meeting. There's one coming up this Wednesday that is a budget work session that may be of interest to many people. That is at 4:30 on Wednesday. Or you can tune in to hear us give you a summary of it later this week. And that concludes our episode.
And if you're the sort of person who thinks this is interesting, then we want to hear from you. Email us at hello@seattlehallpass.org.
We'd love to interview you if you're part of the Seattle school community. And we'd also love to hear any ideas that you have or questions. So get in touch. I'm Christy Robertson.
And I'm Jane Tungstamel. We'll be back with more episodes soon, and we hope you'll join us next time on Seattle Hall Pass.